Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 12 tight end rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. And when we talk about tight ends, a lot of people start to get a little bit of anxiety because over the last couple seasons, the tight end position has not been consistent. And truth be told, the tight end position as an entire whole has a far smaller pool of talent and reliability in terms of fantasy football. So many of us over the last couple years have surely had to deal with the fact that you perhaps have a 6.5 point tight end that's pulling down your roster on a weekly basis, when if in fact you had a better tight end, you could have been winning more fantasy games and potentially a fantasy championship. So on today's episode, besides talking about tight ends in my top 12 rankings, I want to go ahead and start off by telling you about there's a couple specific things that we need to look at before we choose our tight ends this year, because to be honest, it's all about opportunity and it's all about scoring touchdowns for the tight end position, and that's what we're going to start out with. So over the last 2 seasons, the tight end position in terms of opportunity has been pretty small, to say the least. I mean, there have been 7 teams that have targeted their tight end position with 20+% of target share each of the last 2 seasons. That's being the Chiefs, the Eagles, the 49ers, the Colts, the Raiders, the Ravens, and the Titans. Yes, from those teams, you can automatically pick out names like Zach Ertz, George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, and even Mark Andrews, right? So it's already starting to kind of look consistent. Our top 5 tight ends from last season seem to already be on the board because of the fact that they're being granted the opportunity from their organizations, because their organization obviously use the tight end position at a premium. Comparatively to other teams, it's kind of hard to find yourself a tight end that's going to consistently get targets and opportunity on a weekly basis in comparison to some wide receivers, which makes it that much harder to find a consistent tight end. Now, last season, we saw 62 different tight ends finish as a tight end 1 from weeks 1 through 17. In comparison to like the quarterback position, another 1-start position in fantasy football, we saw 40 quarterbacks finish as a tight end 1. Now, you may be thinking, well, Andrew, there's far more tight ends becoming tight end 1s. Isn't that a good thing? Well, in fact, it's quite honestly the opposite. When there's more tight ends finishing as a tight end 1, that just increases the volatility at the position. Considering we're trying to only start 12 on a specific week, there's 12 different teams in your league, maybe even less, maybe 10 teams in your league, and there's so many varieties in terms of tight ends finishing as a top 12, that's only just going to throw a wrench into your system, and it's going to definitely hurt you because your tight end on that given week just wasn't able to outperform others because of opportunities that are at times random. Now, the random opportunity that I refer to is touchdowns. And I mentioned it earlier. Outside of opportunity, in terms of targets, receptions, touchdowns are the next most valuable statistic in terms of the tight end position. Last season, talking about making a tight end 1 from weeks 1 through 17, 67.7% of tight ends who finished as a tight end 1 scored a touchdown in that given week, which means that if you wanted to become a top 12 tight end on a given week, you either had to score a touchdown or score a bunch of points via receptions or yards. And to be honest, a 6-point influx of a touchdown, which in my opinion, touchdowns are far and away the hardest statistic to anticipate and or predict, it just becomes a coin flip at the end of the day at the tight end position on a weekly basis. So when 8 out of the 12 tight ends on a weekly basis are scoring a touchdown, and you don't have one of those 4 guys that are just ripping it apart in terms of receiving yards, like a Darren Waller, it becomes even that much harder for you to at least compete with a tight end. And that's the anxiety that I'm talking about. Having a 6.5 point tight end isn't going to cut it anymore in fantasy. And when you're trying to win a championship, you have to address that. And we have to find the most valuable prospects at the tight end position going into 2020 in order to at least set us up for some success right out the gate. So let's go ahead. Let's start off with my top 12 list. Again, a lot of these guys are far and away tight end 1s, and they've been tight end 1s for the last couple of years, and their consistency because of their opportunity via their teams are going to stay consistent. Because that's just the nature of how their organizations work and how good of a talent they are. Starting off with my number 1, everyone's number 1 tight end, Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce has been the number 1 tight end in fantasy football in a half-point PPR scoring format for the past 4 seasons. He's been a top 25 flex prospect each of the last seasons, finishing as number 25, number 16, and number 20. I mean, Travis Kelce is the end-all, be-all at the tight end position. And in fact, if you draft him in the second round of your draft in order to avoid the risk of a tight end later in your drafts, then I'm not going to be surprised, because that has consistently happened over the last couple of years due to his production. I mean, last season, he had 136 targets, 97 receptions, 1,229 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown, all for 205.8 fantasy points and a 12.86 fantasy point per game average. In terms of the tight end position, nobody can outdo Travis Kelce. He had 14 tight end 1 performances last season. He ran with the offense for majority of the offensive snaps. No tight end played more offensive snaps for their respective team than Travis Kelce, as he played 92.5% of the offensive shares. And in that, when he, played nearly 900 snaps, he was running routes nearly, 2/3 of the time. 614 routes, if I'm not mistaken, was what he ran last season, which even grants him more and more opportunity in an offense that is so high scoring and extremely valuable in terms of when you have Patrick Mahomes throwing you the ball, your targets are far more valuable than if Joe Flacco is doing it. And that comparison makes a huge difference. When we're looking at what Travis Kelce's been able to do, it's not just been the fact that he's been consistent, but that he's consistently improving. When we look at his stats from 2016 and 2017 with Alex Smith, we saw an average Travis Kelce. And to be honest, he was still the number 1 tight end in those 2 years. But once Patrick Mahomes has become the starting quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs organization, Travis Kelce's only improved. In the 29 regular season games that Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce have played together, he's averaged 9 targets, 6.3 receptions, 82.6 receiving yards per game, and 0.48 touchdowns per game on average. If you take that into a 16-game basis, we're talking about Travis Kelce, with 101 receptions, 1,322 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, and averaging 14.42 fantasy points per game. That's the kind of production and improvement he's made over the last couple of years with Mahomes. And to be honest, just to kind of quantify and explain to you how much of an increase it's been a 20% increase in targets, almost 20%, 19% increase in receptions, 18.6% increase in receiving yards, and a 33% increase in touchdowns. With Mahomes in 2018 and 2019, Travis Kelce has just been a completely different quarterback. His game is elevated, and he's going to continue to improve as he and Patrick Mahomes are in their prime of their careers at this moment in time. And when we talk about Travis Kelce, again, opportunity is something that he is not shy away from. The thing that Travis Kelce is so valuable at is not only, being able to score touchdowns on a consistent basis. Again, only 6 last year, but we've seen far more years prior. In 2018, he had scored 10. So the potential is there. And if Mahomes, doesn't miss those 3 games due to the dislocated knee, doesn't have ankle problems all year long, we could see an even better Travis Kelce come in 2020. Again, when we're talking about opportunity, this is a guy that had 12 targets from inside the 10-yard line last year in the red zone. That's second amongst all positions, down in the red zone, whether it's running back, wide receiver, or tight ends. On top of that, this is a guy that on a consistent basis is going to see targets in the red zone from the 20-yard line and in, had 19 targets, tied for first amongst all tight ends with Tyler Higbee. All in all, Travis Kelce is a tight end that is going to be the number 1 because of the fact that, the organization he's associated with, the quarterback play, it's all perfect for Travis Kelce. Everything lines up. The thing that I find so surprising is that as much of a valuable asset touchdowns are in terms of fantasy football, when we talk about a player like Travis Kelce, tight ends don't play that much of a difference. When we looked at his output of last season, he had 122.9 points from receiving yards. He had 48.5 points via receptions and only 36 points from touchdowns. 6 touchdowns, 36 points. So 36 points there was only 17.36% of Travis Kelce's yearly output in total points. To be honest, all in all, when the touchdowns don't really matter much and everything else you're producing is that much more valuable, you become a more consistent tight end. And the touchdowns, again, as random as they are, they're eventually going to come over time. But either way, Travis Kelce, he's my number 1 tight end. And that's pretty much all I really need to talk about. I mean, he's got the eye of his quarterback. He is the number 1 receiver of their offense. He's going to continue to be the number 1 tight end in fantasy football. Moving on to my number 2 tight end, George Kittle. George Kittle only played 14 games last year. He dealt with injury, but on pace, he was going to catch Travis Kelce and potentially become the number 1 tight end last season. He had 107 targets, 85 receptions, 1,053 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns for 180 fantasy points on a 14-game basis. If you go ahead and track that out on a 16-game basis with the 12.86 fantasy points, him and Kelce literally end up with the identical number 1 overall season. And George Kittle, he was going to catch him. I mean, there were a couple games, especially the fact that George Kittle missed the game against the Arizona Cardinals. And as we all remember last season, or if you do remember, the Arizona Cardinals were the easiest matchup at the tight end position. And they were just giving up points freely. And George Kittle, in my opinion, could have had a ball-out game there and potentially finished as the number 1 tight end. Again, in his 14 performances, he had 11 tight end 1 performances. He was second only behind Travis Kelce, but he was going to potentially catch him. All in all, George Kittle is a very interesting tight end. Besides the fact that he as well is the number 1 receiver of his respective offense, and he's going to consistently get a great amount of target share like we've talked about earlier. The thing that kind of interests me and scares me at the same time with George Kittle is his usage in the offense. George Kittle played 87% of the offensive snaps for the 49ers last season, but he only ran 361 routes. Again, that's 361 routes comparatively to Travis Kelce's 614 routes ran. So in terms of opportunity, George Kittle, when he runs routes, the ball has either got to go to him, or you're probably sitting in an area where you're thinking, where's George Kittle this game? Did he completely disappear? Last season, when he ran routes, he was targeted 29.64% of the time. So a 30% target share when he ran routes was perfectly fine. But the rest of the time, he's the 6th offensive lineman, plugging holes and opening up gaps for this rushing attack that's so vital to the entire identity of the San Francisco 49ers. So as we see it, sure, Travis Kelce is going to run far more routes than a guy like George Kittle. But then again, when we're talking about total receptions, again, George Kittle had 85 in 14 games and Travis Kelce had 97. The routes run may make a huge difference, but if you're going to be targeted as highly per route ran, like George Kittle is going to be, it's just only going to get better. And to be honest, if you see him run even more routes in 2020, his opportunity, his fantasy total, and potentially the number 1 overall fantasy football tight end position could be his. We're just going to have to wait and see exactly how this 49ers offense approaches it. With Deebo Samuel missing some time early in the season because of the injury that he sustained this offseason, we could even potentially see him get even more targets, get even more opportunity, and be a guy that at this moment in time could be vying for that number 1 overall spot. All in all, again, he's the number 1 offensive piece for the San Francisco 49ers. Really, they have a plethora of wide receivers and a plethora of running backs that are all in a committee, that are all in a rotation. But the one consistent through line offensive skill position is George Kittle. Outside of the opportunity he gets down the field in the red zone, it has been consistently there. 16 total red zone targets from the 20-yard line and in, and 9 targets from the 10-yard line and in. Again, he's only scored 5 touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons, but consistency is there. At least you have a 5 minimum touchdown base. Everything after that is just going to be gravy for fantasy owners, and I'm excited to see exactly what Kittle is capable of accomplishing in 2020. I don't really need to talk about Kittle more because, to be honest, his statistics, his game, it speaks for itself. But all in all, I really do think that George Kittle, more than ever, going into 2020, has the best opportunity to catch a guy like Travis Kelce. We're just going to have to see whose quarterback wants to target their respective tight end more. All right, moving on. Let's talk about my number 3. Let's talk about Mark Andrews. Now, Mark Andrews was a little bit of a surprise this last season. Again, this was a guy that was drafted in the 10th round on many occasions last season because we weren't 100% certain how Lamar Jackson and this Ravens passing game was going to succeed this coming year. Yeah, we knew that the running game would be there because the Ravens and the running attack was always consistent, but we didn't know if they were going to be able to truly air it out, considering what Lamar Jackson was producing his rookie year in terms of the passing game. Now, what Mark Andrews did in 15 games is absolutely incredible. 98 targets, 64 receptions, 852 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns for 175.2 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format averaging out to 11.68 fantasy points per game. Those are incredible numbers considering the fact that he's the number one receiver on their team. The amount of opportunity that he was granted, he acted upon it, and he definitely delivered. In an offense that was far and away the number one rushing and passing attack in the National Football League last season, it was no surprise that Mark Andrews was consistently seeing touchdowns, because for as many times as the Baltimore Ravens made it to the red zone, there was going to be opportunities for Mark Andrews knocking at the door. And that's what helped him get his 9 tight end 1 performances. That's what helped him get to the level that he was at, becoming the number 4 overall tight end last season in just his second year in the National Football League. On top of it, there's a couple of things that a lot of people have been talking about this offseason. The fact that Hayden Hurst was traded to the Atlanta Falcons, it's going to make a big difference. But the way that I personally see it is that the Baltimore Ravens love to use 12 personnel. 1 running back, 2 tight ends. And last season they did that a lot, whether it was with Mark Andrews, Hayden Hurst, or Nick Boyle. Now, with the absence of Hayden Hurst, it doesn't automatically grant a guy like Mark Andrews 30 extra targets and far more opportunity that way. I just see it as a chance for another tight end to potentially, like Nick Boyle, get more opportunity in this offense and potentially get more targets. But on a weekly basis, if I see, Mark Andrews perhaps haul in 1 or 2 extra targets a week, that's exactly what I expect to see. I mean, the identity of Hayden Hurst in this Ravens offense last year was basically a secondary option on a shorter route and a blocking option. That was his primary talent and his primary function for this offense last year. And to be honest, if we barely see any movement in terms of the total opportunity for Mark Andrews, I won't entirely be surprised. But either way, Mark Andrews, not really much of a blocking tight end. This is a receiver. And, when I talk about wide receivers in a tight end's body, that's exactly what Mark Andrews has been for the Baltimore Ravens, especially in the last 2 seasons. Last season, he ran, in terms of his total snap count, he had a 31.8% target share in terms of the amount of routes that he ran. To be honest, Mark Andrews, all in all, has been one of the more ridiculous tight ends. He's kind of similar to the George Kittle respect, to where he doesn't run that many routes, but when he does, the ball is going to be thrown in his direction regardless, because he has the eye of Lamar Jackson. And the majority of the time, those plays are designed to get him the ball. And when we have Mark Andrews being the number 1 receiver for this respective offense and how successful they were last year, I could potentially see Mark Andrews even improving it that much more. When we look at the Ravens and what they've done in the past 2 seasons, like I mentioned earlier, they're one of the 7 offenses that have targeted their tight end position 20+% of the time each of the last 2 years. In 2018, they targeted the tight end position 127 times. That number jumped to 180 this last season. They had a 22.84% target share from the quarterback position in 2018. That number jumped to 40.91%. That's an 18% target share boost just for the tight end position as a whole. And then in terms of total fantasy points scored, the Ravens tight ends in 2018 scored 180.9, while they nearly, the number is absolutely astonishing. They put up 116 more points. 116 more points as they put up 296.7 points in fantasy as a tight end room. It's absolutely ridiculous. On a point per game average, that's 7 extra points per week to the tight end position. All in all, Mark Andrews was ridiculous last year. Now, where exactly does he potentially lie in this season? Where is his potential ceiling and floor? Touchdowns are a big random chance in terms of fantasy football, but I don't really think the Mark Andrews touchdowns were random. In terms of what he did in the red zone, 7 of his 10 touchdowns came from the red zone, 4 of them coming from the 10-yard line and in. So he was utilized as a big target down there in the red zone in order to help this offense, score at the end of their drives. He's going to consistently be that for this offense. And on top of it, there's something that a lot of Mark Andrews owners last season remember. Mark Andrews was injured nearly the entire season. After week 1, he had the questionable tag and missed practice on a consistent weekly basis due to injuries. And we saw that as on a weekly basis, we really didn't even know if Mark Andrews was going to start on Sundays. And at times on Friday, we were looking for that injury report to see if he had been on it or completely wiped off. And at times he was still on the injury report going into Friday practice, completing practice, and the uncertainty of him starting on Sundays was truly a weekly, anxiety that a lot of fantasy owners had to have, including myself. So if we can continue to see improvement from Mark Andrews, a little bit more of a target share sprinkle because of the absence of Hayden Hurst, and then you go in ahead and add the fact that he stays healthy in this offense with their effectiveness, the fact that they want to run the ball as effectively as they do and then hit teams with play action, I think Mark Andrews at number 3 is not a bold statement. I think it's just the inevitability of his talent, and that's where I leave it at. All right, moving on to number 4, Zach Ertz. Now, honestly, I could see Zach Ertz finishing at number 3. I could. In all honesty, I could. But Dallas Goedert is going to always take a couple targets here and there on a weekly basis, perhaps a couple touchdowns away from Zach Ertz that truly hurts him by the end of the season. Now, Zach Ertz last season, he only played 15 games, finished with 135 targets, 88 receptions for 916 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, 171.6 fantasy points per game for an 11.44 fantasy point per game average. Finished with 7 tight end 1 performances. I mean, Zach Ertz last season was normal Zach Ertz. If you go look at his total contributions as a tight end for the Philadelphia Eagles, this number line looks eerily similar to his production in 2016 and 2017. His 2018 numbers got us very excited because he broke records through and through. I mean, he had the most targets that I've ever seen for a tight end position, and he completed a season with the most receptions a tight end has ever had, breaking Jason Witten's record. He had 156 targets for 116 receptions in 2018. And we knew that number was not going to be able to be repeated because, again, it had a lot to do with the fact that Nick Foles was in that offense, Carson Wentz was getting injured, the receiver position for the Philadelphia Eagles just wasn't consistent enough on a weekly basis. We saw that be a problem for this organization. I got to fix something real quick. Okay. Sorry about that. But overall, when we think about, Zach Ertz, he's still one of the more consistent tight ends in the National Football League. In terms of target share for the tight end position, the Eagles have targeted the tight end position nearly 36% of their total target share in the last 2 seasons. And when we talk about his capabilities and his potential with Carson Wentz under center, it makes a pretty big difference. Similar to how I kind of broke down what Travis Kelce was able of, producing on a weekly basis with Patrick Mahomes, I have similar numbers to, Zach Ertz with Carson Wentz. When Carson Wentz and Zach Ertz have started together in the last 2 seasons, Zach Ertz has averaged 9.27 targets, 6.54 receptions, 68.84 receiving yards, and 0.46 receiving touchdowns. That averages out on a 16-game basis to 12.78 fantasy points per game, 1,100 yards, 7 touchdowns, 105 receptions. And to be honest, if Zach Ertz puts up a season like that in 2020, I'm not going to be surprised. I honestly won't, because I know that he's a capable enough tight end to do that, and he's the number 1 receiver of this offense. So when he gets 150 targets, it's not going to be a surprise because the opportunity has been there year in and year out for a guy like Zach Ertz. In terms of opportunity in the red zone, 16 red zone targets, 5 within the 10-yard line that led to 4 touchdowns last season. So he's consistently getting that work down on the goal line as a receiving threat. All in all, I think Zach Ertz, he has a potential of finishing as the tight end 3. We'll see how a healthy, complete receiving core is going to affect these Eagles offense. Again, last season, they didn't have Alshon Jeffrey. They didn't have a healthy Deshaun Jackson, Jalen Reagor. You add Marquise Goodwin. You're adding a lot of healthy pieces that are potentially going to take targets away from a guy like Zach Ertz, or potentially pull away attention from Zach Ertz. As last season, again, he was the number 1 receiving threat for majority of the back half of the year. And a lot of defenses had to respect that. And a lot of defenses made sure that they stopped Zach Ertz at every possible, down that they could. So if you open up the offense and you stretch the field more and you give more opportunity to Zach Ertz, I don't see him landing outside the top 4 any other way. So he sits at number 4 with a consistent opportunity. Moving on to number 5. One of the crazier things that I'm going to preach today. Again, there are a lot of names on today's list that I see that probably are a little crazy, but I think Tyler Higbee might be one of the craziest at number 5. Tyler Higbee played 15 games last season, totaled for pretty decent stats. I mean, he finished with the most receiving yards in Rams history as a tight end, which is kind of a ridiculous number considering 734 receiving yards on 69, receptions and 3 touchdowns. Doesn't seem like, too hot of numbers, but overall he finished with 125.9 fantasy points in 15 games for 8.39 fantasy point per game average. Now you may be thinking, Andrew, 8.5 fantasy point, those are the tight ends we're trying to avoid. Why are you suggesting this guy as your number 5? Well, Tyler Higbee had 8 tight end 1 performances last season. And a lot of that had to, actually, no, I don't think he had 8. I think he had 6. He had 6 tight end 1 performances. That's a misclick. He had 6 tight end 1 performances last season. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the offense just wasn't the same as they were in 2018. The lack of contributions from Todd Gurley in the passing game and the lack of opportunity that Brandon Cooks got late in the season last season was 100% the factor that increased Tyler Higbee's targets, receptions, and total productivity in this offense. Thinking of Tyler Higbee prior to the second half of the NFL season, we thought, okay, Tyler Higbee, 3-4 catches on his best game possible. If he gets a lucky touchdown, great. Otherwise, he's scoring 3 points in a given week. And that's really what Tyler Higbee has been. He's really been a blocking tight end for this offense. And, last year we did see a little bit of Gerald Everett in that Tampa Bay game, in the Seattle game in the middle of the season. We saw some contributions from the tight end position of the Rams where we typically don't see it. But again, we were getting more contributions from tight ends. Gurley's absence in terms of the passing game and Brandon Cooks really made a difference. But what really took it above everything was as soon as Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp were really the only 2 receiving options that were being respected and honestly double covered at times for the Los Angeles Rams, there was really an opportunity for another receiver to step up. And that's what Tyler Higbee did from weeks 13 through 17. The guy averaged a ridiculous amount of fantasy points, 17.14 fantasy points per game on the 5-game stretch. In those 5 games, he had 7+ receptions and he had 100+ receiving yards in 4 out of those 5 games and 2 touchdowns in those 5 games. I mean, accumulating 85.7 fantasy points in a 5-week stretch, that's absolutely ridiculous. But when we think about exactly why this was possible, it is a culmination of just an entire offensive shift. And when I think about how the offense of the Rams is going to approach the 2020 season, no more Gurley, no more Brandon Cooks, you get Gerald Everett back. I honestly think, and I've been hearing whispers of Sean McVay potentially kind of trying to re-emulate the 2010 offense of the New England Patriots, where you had Aaron Hernandez and Rob Gronkowski absolutely torch defense on top of having your Wes Welker in the slot position, a la Cooper Kupp, and then your Deion Branch on the outside, which would be the Robert Woods of this offense. I think running 12 personnel with 1 running back, whether it's Darrell Henderson or Cam Akers, with the Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee combination, that's going to open up even more opportunities for this team. And to be honest, I might be crazy in thinking that Tyler Higbee is capable of staying with that consistently. Sure, he's not going to score 17 points per game. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a 10-point tight end that on a weekly basis will have the upside of being, the touchdown guy that scores 15, 14 points. That's what I'm anticipating. When I looked at what he was capable of doing in the red zone last season, from the 20-yard line and in, he tied for the most targets amongst tight ends with Travis Kelce, and he had 14 receptions on 19 targets. The opportunity is there. Obviously, Jared Goff is looking in his direction like he did for the last 5 games of the 2019 season. He was targeted on 29.47% of his routes ran. All I can say is that the sky's the limit for Tyler Higbee, and that's what I'm expecting. So overall, that's why I have him as my number 5 tight end. Moving on. Let's talk about my number 6, Darren Waller. Darren Waller, again, was another one of these breakout guys, similar to Mark Andrews, came out of nowhere. There's a lot of tight ends last season that truly did come out of nowhere because of injuries and because of inconsistencies of guys that we previously had thought were going to be viable tight ends. But Darren Waller certainly was a viable tight end with 117 targets, 90 receptions, 1,145 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, averaging out for 11 fantasy points per game with a 176 fantasy point total. Darren Waller was absolutely incredible, but my problem was his 3 receiving touchdowns. Again, touchdowns are something that you're not going to see on a weekly basis, but you hope that a guy that's going to touch the ball and receive the ball 90 times, that he might get more work in the red zone. But we really didn't see that from the Raiders offense, because to be honest, the Raiders offense struggled a lot last season. But what we're going to see in 2020 is a far improved offense, considering what they've added and what they have returning. You're going to have a healthy Josh Jacobs. You're going to have a healthy Hunter Renfrow, a healthy Tyrell Williams. Those are three guys that last season missed a significant amount of time in this offense. Then you bring in Jason Witten, another great blocking tight end who won't have to force Darren Waller to stay in as many routes. And then you have yourself your number 1 overall pick, Henry Ruggs. This entire offense as a whole is going to be a far more improved version of itself than the year prior. And to be honest, the Raiders want to target the tight end position. That's exactly what Derek Carr has done each of the last 2 seasons, whether it was a Jared Cook in 2018 or Darren Waller this last year. And this last season, due to the injuries that surrounded Darren Waller, there was more opportunity for him to break out and be this huge tight end that finishes the number 3 in a half PPR scoring format. But overall, when you get far more offensive potential pieces and far more talent to surround Derek Carr, the ball is going to spread out more. And I think, yes, there's going to be a little bit of regression from Darren Waller, but we're going to see, some appreciation in terms of his total receiving touchdowns, a little bit of a decrease in his receptions, his opportunities, his receiving yards. But all in all, he's going to have a similar year to last year. I mean, when we look at what he was capable of doing last season, 5 games of 100+ receiving yards. Not a lot of tight ends do that because, to be honest, Darren Waller really isn't a tight end. Even in college, at Georgia Tech, was it Georgia Tech, Georgia State? I think it was Georgia Tech. He was a wide receiver. When he was drafted to come to the NFL, he was drafted as a wide receiver, but then transitioned to the tight end position because of his big body and big frame. So when I talk about receivers in a tight end body, that's truly what Darren Waller has been for his entire career in the National Football League. And that's why he was able to break out and have such huge receiving yard games. I mean, this is a guy that had the most yard after the catch. I think him and George Kittle were the top 2 at the tight end position. He had 6.6 yards after the catch per reception last season. And to be honest, it's not really a surprise considering he's a wide receiver. He's got the speed and the ability to make plays after the catch. Playing 90% of the offensive snaps last season, that's a pretty good number for Darren Waller. Having ran routes on only 53% of them is a little bit of an unfortunate fact, but when you get Jason Witten in there and you can have Darren Waller run that many more routes, perhaps put him in the slot position to get him more comfortable, I expect Darren Waller to be just as good of a tight end as he was last season. There was a couple inconsistencies. Again, like I mentioned, the touchdown numbers weren't there, and he had 5 games last season of 6 or less fantasy points. I expect the touchdown games that will eventually increase, perhaps get him from 3 touchdowns to 6 touchdowns this year, to potentially, kind of eliminate some of those contests that really hurt fantasy owners. But all in all, I think Darren Waller is a go-to tight end. I mean, he's just too talented at this moment in time to pass up on. Anyway, moving on to my number 7, we have Evan Engram. Evan Engram has been injured each of the last 2 seasons, a pretty significant margin. Now, Evan Engram is a talent that we cannot ignore. And even in the 8 games that he played last season in 2019, he still produced 68 targets, 44 receptions, 467 yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 87.4 fantasy points, which is a 10.9 fantasy point per game average. Pretty good for a tight end. Even though he missed the second half of the season, he has been consistent like this throughout his entire career. But the injury bug has hurt him. Similar to the guy like Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook has been injured the first 2 seasons of his career. Were we willing to take the risk on him in 2019? For those of you who did, it paid off in full. Hopefully, Evan Engram can be the tight end that does that for us this year because, again, a lot of people are afraid of drafting Evan Engram. But the stats that I want to present that really give me confidence in Evan Engram are the fact that outside of only Austin Hooper, Evan Engram is the only other tight end last season to play 70+% of his offensive snaps of the entire team, and on 70% of his offensive snaps ran a route. He is primarily a receiving threat. I mean, to be honest, this is a guy that ran a 4.3 4.40 at the combine. So when we're talking about Evan Engram, he really is a wide receiver on the field, an extra receiving threat. And to be honest, Daniel Jones targeted him as much as possible. Yes, he may have gotten more targets per game with Eli Manning, but that was just because we haven't seen as much of a total share with Daniel Jones. Again, they've only played 6 games together in comparison. So going into a full potential 2020 season, what can we see? I mean, the Giants, they targeted the tight end position last year 140 times. That's 6th most amongst the NFL. Again, this past season, they targeted the target share to the tight end position was 20+%, which honestly, it's a pretty good improvement from the year prior. When we looked at the tight end position, or when I kind of analyzed how good tight ends were for the New York Giants, after Engram went down, Rhett Ellison was a decent tight end, and then Caden Smith was a recent, pretty good tight end, or decent enough to make do in the back half of the season. When I took the best tight end performance from every single week, weeks 1 through 16 for the New York Giants, 1 through 17, excuse me, they averaged 10.41 fantasy points per game. So even without Evan Engram in the lineup, tight ends were getting the ball delivered to them on a weekly basis in the Giants organization, because they made it a concerted effort to give tight ends an opportunity. To be honest, all in all, missing 13 games in the past 2 seasons, it's going to hurt. Averaging 9.78 fantasy points per game for Engram throughout his career, that's a good number. But if we can improve upon it, have similar numbers to last year, add himself into an offense that honestly is far improved. When you have Daniel Jones going into his second year, you have a far more healthy and improved offensive line. Golden Tate, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, obviously Saquon Barkley. Evan Engram is perhaps at times the least of a defense's concerns. And when he has the speed and the athleticism that he potentially can act upon if healthy, I honestly do see Evan Engram as another one of these guys that could vie for a top 5 spot easily. So hopefully that's the case. Either way, Evan Engram has got the talent. Moving on to my number 8, Hayden Hurst. Hayden Hurst is another one of these bold predictions. Hayden Hurst played all 16 games for the Ravens last season. This offseason, he was traded to the Atlanta Falcons, considering Austin Hooper took a huge deal with the Cleveland Browns. Now, unfortunately for Austin Hooper, he is going to an organization that, as of right now, in my opinion, may not target him as much, but the opportunity that Hayden Hurst is walking into is incredible. Last season for the Ravens, he only had 39 targets, 30 receptions for 349 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and averaged 3.87 fantasy points per game. When we talk about what Austin Hooper was capable of doing last season, this is a guy in 13 games had 97 receptions for 75 yards, 787 receiving yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns for an 11.86 fantasy point per game average. Austin Hooper was incredible last season, and that's the opportunity that Hayden Hurst is walking into, in my opinion. Because sure, Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley, they're going to get their targets consistently every single year. And as the Atlanta Falcons are going to throw the ball 630 plus times this year, there's going to be opportunity for Hayden Hurst to take and really run away with the Austin Hooper, total tight end opportunity. Because of the fact that Austin Hooper has been so good each of the last 2 seasons. Again, Austin Hooper has been the number 6 tight end in 2018 and in 2019. It's mainly had to do with the fact that this offense wants to find a tight end to feed the ball to. They need to run 11 personnel, 1 tight end, 1 running back. And when you have Todd Gurley as the new receiving back of this team, and when we looked at what he was capable of doing as a receiving back in Los Angeles, Todd Gurley was a non-factor in the receiving game in 2019. And if that's, the potential of Todd Gurley's 2020 season, then Hayden Hurst is getting even more targets in this offense. Not to mention the fact that, I've always said it, the fact that Dirk Cutter, the former Tampa Bay Buccaneers head coach, is now the offensive coordinator for the Atlanta Falcons, and he was the offensive coordinator for the Falcons in 2012, 2013, and 2014, and then now just recently took up the mantle in 2019. We've always seen him target tight ends in his offenses. His offense has always been predicated on feeding tight ends. From 2012 to 2014, he fed Tony Gonzalez the ball 125 targets per season in that span of years. In the past couple of seasons as the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they targeted their tight ends, Cameron Brayton and O.J. Howard, 100 plus times total a season. It's no surprise that Hayden Hurst is in line for a huge opportunity with the Atlanta Falcons. And to be honest, the opportunity that he's getting isn't just targets, isn't just receptions, it's also red zone opportunity. I mean, Austin Hooper had 18 red zone targets. Was it last season? 18, yeah. No, yeah, he had 18 red zone targets. He was second technically, but that's because the first place tied with 19. So technically, he had the third most targets at the tight end position in the red zone last season. And he had 9 targets from the 10-yard line and then leading the 5 touchdowns. 5 of his 6 touchdowns coming from the red zone. It's no surprise that Austin Hooper was such a good tight end last season because the opportunity was there when the talent was there. Hayden Hurst may not be as talented in the passing game, but overall as a tight end with the opportunity that's going to be given to him, I really do think he's going to run away with it. And there's a reason why they went out and they specifically traded for him instead of going to sign another tight end or draft a rookie, because they know Hayden Hurst has the talent to pick up exactly where Hooper left off. All right, moving on. Mike Gesicki. Mike Gesicki is a very interesting tight end. I mean, his rookie season in 2018 was completely ignored by Adam Gase, and that continues to just pile upon my angry rant for Adam Gase and why I really do think that some of the decision-making he does on a consistent basis makes it hard for me to trust any of the offensive pieces that are in his respective offense. Now, thank God that Adam Gase no longer is the head coach of the Miami Dolphins. And now there's a chance for Mike Gesicki because that's exactly what we saw last season. I mean, Mike Gesicki came out of college as a 57 reception, 573 receiving yard, 9 touchdown tight end out of Penn State. His rookie year ended with 22 receptions for 202 receiving yards and 0 touchdowns. So when we think about what Mike Gesicki is really capable of, he kind of showed, a couple glimpses this past season. Sure, 89 targets for 51 receptions. That's not a great catching percentage, but we'll talk about that in a bit. It still led to 570 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, 110.5 total points. He finished as a tight end 1 in the top 12 tight end big board. Finished with 5 top 12 tight end performances and a 6.91 fantasy point per game average. Here's the difference. He's kind of similar to Tyler Higbee in the fact that Mike Gesicki through majority of the season just wasn't utilized. I mean, from weeks 1 through 11, saw 59% of the offensive snap share, only averaged 4.14 fantasy points per game, and was miserable. And as soon as this offense really started to open up and they decided, okay, we have to use Mike Gesicki as an offensive piece, considering Preston Williams went down, just Albert Wilson just was nothing. Outside of Devontae Parker, there really wasn't any other offensive threats in this offense as a whole. And Ryan Fitzpatrick, he did not give a single F. He wanted to get the ball out of his hands and he wanted to win games. And that's what he did with the help of Mike Gesicki from weeks 12 through 17. Mike Gesicki averaged 11.52 fantasy points per game and played 74% of the offensive snap share. That's a huge difference maker, increasing nearly 15% of the snap share as a whole. I mean, that's going to grant you more opportunity, and the targets were certainly there in that time. In that time, the Dolphins tight end, he played in the slot position 72% of the time. He had 15 targets of 20 plus yards throughout the season, only 3 drops throughout his entire, 89 targets. So there's another 35 targets in there that were either overthrown, Ryan Fitzpatrick, or the ball just never got there. So when we add, Tua Tagovailoa to this offense as their first round pick, in my opinion, an offensive position that is going to make the biggest difference for a young tight end like Mike Gesicki. Sure, Ryan Fitzpatrick was going to throw passes that maybe other quarterbacks weren't going to throw. That gave Mike Gesicki even more opportunity. But all in all, I think the accuracy of said targets are going to increase with Tua under center, hopefully this season. As a whole, this offense, besides Tua, is going to improve. You brought in Jordan Howard. You brought in Matt Breida. You have Preston Williams coming back. You still have Devontae Parker. As an offense as a whole, they are far more of a threat. Their offensive line has improved at times. And to be honest, I think Mike Gesicki is one of the tight ends in the National Football League at this moment in time that's going to see another one of these boosts of opportunity, considering you have a young rookie quarterback who's going to look for a safety blanket in the eyes of Mike Gesicki. Last season had 11 red zone targets, leading to 4 receptions. Those are numbers that could potentially increase and only make his 2020 season even better. That's why he's at my number 9. Moving on to number 10, Jared Cook. Jared Cook has been fantastic each of the last 2 seasons in fantasy football. It's incredible that considering how long he's played in the National Football League, he's continued to improve. But last season, he played 14 games, completed, a pretty remarkable season in my opinion. With 65 targets, he had 43 receptions, right? 43 receptions on a 14-game season is 3 receptions per game on average. He had 705 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns on 43 receptions for a 10.43 fantasy point per game average and a total of 146 fantasy points. That's kind of ridiculous. That led to 9 tight end 1 performances last season, which got me thinking, what kind of targets was he seeing? His depth of target was, a far wider margin than he saw the year prior. And to be honest, his targets just had more value in it because it led to more touchdowns. But Jared Cook wasn't always this, this consistent this consistent tight end last season. From weeks 1 through 4, Jared Cook was nobody. I mean, he scored, an abysmal amount of points. 3.25 fantasy point per game average from weeks 1 through 4. Embarrassing. From weeks 5 through 17, for the rest of the games, for the 10 other games that he played, he averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game because he scored all of his touchdowns in that time frame. He scored 9 touchdowns in 10 games. Of course, he's going to be a fantastic tight end because he's getting these touchdowns that potentially Alvin Kamara should have gotten last season. Again, outside of that, I think the last time that Alvin Kamara scored was week 4 against the Seattle Seahawks, was it week 3? And then after that, he didn't score until he played Tennessee in week 16. There's huge disparities in terms of touchdowns that, in my opinion, are going to level out this season in the Saints offense. You bring in a guy like Emmanuel Sanders. The fact that Jared Cook only played, 50% of the offensive snaps, and he only ran 365 routes and was targeted only 18% of the time when he ran routes, kind of leads me to believe that, sure, a lot of his tight end, touchdowns and his receptions were big yardage plays, but I think those are going to go outside of his direction this coming season, which is going to make him dip in terms of total fantasy points. Now, if he ends up producing similar targets and receptions, great. I could potentially see that in this offense, but there's no way that we end up seeing a 10 plus touchdown season from Jared Cook in this offense when you have the likes of Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara, Taysom Hill, Emmanuel Sanders, and Latavius Murray also vying for targets themselves. So it's kind of hard for me to believe, but there's always a potential. Either way, I think Jared Cook is a great tight end. I'm just a little weary on him in considering what he was capable of doing last season. When you're averaging 3 catches a game and you're producing the numbers that he was producing, it doesn't create a recipe for success in my eyes. And that's why we're going to go ahead and move on from Jared Cook and go to my number 11, Noah Fant. Another one of these bold predictions. Here we go. So Noah Fant is an interesting prospect. Rookie season last year had 66 targets, 40 receptions, 562 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, 91 total points, and a 5.69 fantasy point per game average. Now, you add Pat Shurmur as the offensive coordinator of the Denver Broncos. Now, what does that mean? That is the former offensive coordinator of the New York Giants. We just talked about a little bit ago how much the Giants wanted to target the tight end position last year. And the Giants, they'll be fine with that. Pat Shurmur, they get Jason Garrett. He loves tight end targeting, no problem. But Pat Shurmur is going to bring in an offense that wants to run 3 wide receiver sets, 11 personnel with 1 running back as a receiving guy, whether it's Melvin Gordon or Phillip Lindsay, along with a singular tight end to complement the offense. And I think that's where Noah Fant is going to take his sophomore year jump and really become a huge offensive, piece for the Denver Broncos. Again, the Denver Broncos have gone and made a huge splash in this offseason, making sure that their offensive pieces in terms of wide receiver, offensive line, and running back are far improved. And even, in fact, at the tight end position, they went and drafted in the 4th round Drew Lock's former Missouri tight end, who, in fact, in the last 2 seasons of Drew Lock's college career, had 17 touchdowns with Drew Lock. So you're going ahead and you're adding another tight end because the tight end position is extremely valuable in a Pat Shurmur offense. You have a guy that Noah Fant already is a 4.5, speed 40 tight end, a 6'5", 250-pound guy that across the middle of the field can catch a slant and go 75 yards as he proved last season. In my opinion, Noah Fant has a huge opportunity to potentially be the Evan Engram of this offense. Sure, there are other offensive pieces that are going to get, there's Cortland Suttons that are going to, easily take the most targets on a weekly basis. This isn't an offense that wants to target their tight ends at a premium amount. But I hope that the addition to Pat Shurmur as the offensive coordinator goes ahead and takes them in the direction of feeding Noah Fant the ball more often. Obviously, we didn't see too much of an opportunity with him and Drew Lock to play together. They played 5 games together. In that time, Noah Fant caught 10 of his 14 passes for 188 yards and a touchdown. Sure, that only helps as their offseason potentially can increase their their comfort level together. But all in all, inexperienced quarterbacks often will either check down the ball or look for their tight end, and I'm hoping Noah Fant will be that tight end improvement this year. That's why he's at my number 11. Moving on to my last tight end, Hunter Henry. Played 12 games last season, had 6 tight end 1 performances, and to be honest, he's kind of the Terminator. He got injured. We thought he was going to be out for far longer, only missed 4 games, came back, and was just as consistent. Had 55 receptions on 76 targets for 652 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, 10.22 fantasy point per game average in that 12-game span. I mean, to be honest, Hunter Henry is a perfect tight end. In terms of all tight ends last season, when the quarterback position targeted their respective tight ends, no other quarterback had a higher passer rating than Phillip Rivers when targeting Hunter Henry. So to be honest, Hunter Henry is going to be the go-to for this offense. And you may be thinking, okay, Hunter Henry has dealt with injuries in the past. Sure, he played 78% of the snap share for the Chargers last season. He ran 68% of the time, regular routes. What is he going to do without Phillip Rivers? Is he going to be able to be just as viable of a tight end with Justin Herbert or Tyrod Taylor? To be honest, Justin Herbert, similar to like I've talked about earlier, inexperienced quarterbacks are going to look for their tight ends. And I'm hoping, that's the case. But for Tyrod Taylor, to be honest, I went and I looked at how much he's used tight ends in the past. When he was the starting quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, he targeted Charles Clay, who in my opinion is a far less talented tight end than Hunter Henry. almost 93 times a year, 92.88 targets per season, 61 receptions, 639.22 receiving yards, and 3.5 receiving touchdowns per year. That was Charles Clay's 4-year stretch with Tyrod Taylor. So to be honest, Tyrod Taylor is not shy of throwing the ball to his better receivers. And if in fact that's a tight end, he's not afraid of it. And that's definitely going to be, hopefully, the difference maker for Hunter Henry's 2020 season, because some of these other receiving threats of the Chargers, they're up in the air. I don't know how Keenan Allen or Mike Williams are going to play with the quarterback play at hand. But all I know for certain is that Austin Eckler is going to get his checkdowns, and Hunter Henry is going to be open in the middle of the field, as he consistently has been over the last couple seasons. He's consistently seen targets in the red zone, 10 targets, leading to 4 receptions, 6 from inside the 10-yard line, leading to 3 receptions for touchdowns. All in all, I'm confident in Hunter Henry. I like my tight end rankings. Again, they're always subject to change, as it says above me. If you like today's video, don't forget, click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more 2020 fantasy football content. I think today's video was a little longer than I expected, but all in all, it got to the point. And next time we'll be talking about wide receivers. But again, the tight end position, it's tricky. We're going to see new names, and we're also going to see guys that we expect to make the top 12 list somehow fall out, whether it's injury and or a lack of opportunity. But either way, thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I appreciate it. I'll see you guys. Peace.